Thank you. It's great to be at the Virginia Forum this spring. It's really incredible to think about everything that's happened to Confederate memorials and the names of buildings and schools throughout Virginia since we last saw each other just a few years ago. Fortunately, there is now a larger and better understanding of the emergence and celebration of Confederate culture in the late 19th and early 20th century, when the lost cause narrative and white supremacy were so strong throughout Virginia. Alexandria was certainly all in for commemorating the Confederacy during that time, with Confederate veterans erecting their memorial to fallen comrades in 1889. The Sons of Confederate Veterans and the United Daughters of the Confederacy established chapters that remain active today. And in fact, the Children of the Confederacy was first established in Alexandria in 1896. Considering the experiences of white Alexandrians during the Civil War, it's really perhaps not that surprising. Alexandria was occupied by the Union Army for the duration of the war, and it was also the childhood home of Robert E. Lee. But what I want to focus on today, what I want to talk about now, takes place much later, right in the middle of the 20th century, when Alexandria was pursuing growth and development and investing in its future, but also struggling with its identity and the emerging civil rights movement. Post-World War II boom, Alexandria, like a lot of other places, experienced tremendous growth in its population, its economy, and even in its size. By 1952, Alexandria had annexed 8 square miles from Fairfax County, which doubled the size of the city. Alexandria was and is an independent city, established decades before Washington, D.C., but it was increasingly recognized as a Washington suburb. Although the Chamber of Commerce and the railroad industry called it a gateway to the South, Alexandria still considered itself as part of the South, and Confederate legacy groups reinforced the city's identity as Southern and white. By the mid-20th century, Alexandria was home to thousands of newcomers who worked for the federal government, at the Pentagon, and at Fort Belvoir. It was also home to a significant African American population, whose separate and unequal facilities included 2 movie theaters, a recreation center, and a library, which was the result of the 1939 library sit-in orchestrated by attorney Samuel Wilbert Tucker. In addition to the library sit-in, Alexandria had witnessed other acts of civil disobedience, like the arrests of 2 black women in 1932 for refusing to move from their seats on an interstate Greyhound bus. So by 1950, Alexandria leaders were certainly aware of the fight for racial equality and civil rights. And in the 1950s, city leaders, with Sons of Confederate Veteran members among them, were publicly embracing and celebrating the city's Confederate heritage and Robert E. Lee in particular. And this elevation of Confederate culture would continue for years to come. For many, it would also mean valuing nostalgia over progress, longing for a past where whites maintained control and power over blacks, rather than a progressive view of the future where civil rights and integration would be considered. In 1951, Alexandria decided to name a new school for Robert E. Lee, despite already having a school named Lee less than a mile away. The old school, once named for Lee, would become the Prince Street School, and the brand new elementary school would bear Lee's name. In 1952, Alexandria's annexation of the Fairfax County land became effective, and the new property included a school that was already named Lee Jackson. So with a school already named for Lee and another one named for Matthew Morey, Alexandria renamed the former Lee Jackson School as Stonewall Jackson, preserving its association with another Confederate leader. That same year, the City Council announced plans to name new north-south streets for high-ranking Confederate officers. Well-known and lesser-known Confederate officers, Beauregard, Pickett, Imboden, Pegram, Bragg, Quantrell, Early, Breckinridge, Van Dorn, this list goes on, and those street names remain today. Alexandria also renamed part of U.S. Route 1 as Jefferson Davis Highway, ensuring that Alexandria's association with the former Confederacy would be evident to motorists traveling through Alexandria on the highway, as well as to newcomers moving into the suburban West End. But the street names and the school buildings would not be enough. For the R.E. Lee camp of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, the city of Alexandria needed to pursue an explicit public connection between Robert E. Lee and the city itself. In 1955, the R.E. Lee camp proposed that Lee's name be added to the slogan that appeared on the city's letterhead. The City Council agreed and voted to change the slogan from Hometown of George Washington to Hometown of George Washington and Robert E. Lee. City officials took the newly adopted slogan to heart. That summer, when city officials learned that the U.S. Post Office was planning to premiere a new postage stamp with Robert E. Lee in Norfolk, Councilman Frank Mann tried to convince them to do it in Alexandria instead. The Post Office Department, as the U.S. Postal Service was then known, refused, because the first day sales of the Lee stamp were already scheduled for Norfolk, where the American Philatelic Society's annual meeting was being held. In response, Alexandria arranged for a flight attendant to purchase 2,200 Lee stamps in Norfolk the morning of the release and then fly them back to Alexandria. And of course, Alexandria was able to open its own Confederate Post Office and sell them on the same day as Norfolk. On September 21st, the Assistant U.S. Postmaster General joined city officials and representatives from both the local Sons of Confederate Veterans and the UDC chapters as the Chamber of Commerce opened a booth where stamps were sold and hand-canceled on the first day of issue. In addition to the festivities at the Chamber's headquarters, then located at the Lyceum, the day included a special service at Christ Church and a luncheon at the George Mason Hotel, which was located on the corner of Prince and Washington, overlooking the Confederate statue. It's hard to imagine a bigger celebration had Alexandria actually been the host city rather than the overlooked hometown of Robert E. Lee. In 1957, Alexandria celebrated the sesquicentennial of Lee's birth with tours of historic buildings associated with Lee. Because it was also Washington's 225th birthday, Alexandria combined the occasion with a month of special tours for what was called Virginia Heritage Month. These included Lee's childhood home, Christ Church, where he worshiped, and even the Confederate Museum inside the R.E. Lee Camp Hall on Prince Street. Alexandria's celebration of Lee's birthday brought about the revelation that some of Lee's lost citizenship rights had never been restored. This prompted a Republican senator from Indiana to introduce a resolution to restore Lee's, quote, lost civil rights, an idea that was supported by Senators Harry Byrd, Jim Eastland, Strom Thurmond, and others who opposed civil rights for African Americans. Of course, several of Alexandria's own elected officials opposed the civil rights movement and refused to support integration. But one in particular, Delegate James Thompson, was a major strategist of massive resistance. A columnist called Thompson, quote, a leader of the most fanatic, segregationists throughout the massive resistance era. Thompson was also a brother-in-law to Harry Burr Jr. and an active member of the local Sons of Confederate Veterans, and even served as the camp commander at one point. As Black parents from Alexandria, Arlington, and around the state fought to desegregate schools, Thompson used his position to launch the Committee on Law Reform and Racial Activities, which targeted the NAACP, proposed investigating teachers and textbooks, and interrogated, in closed hearings, parents who had filed suit to desegregate Arlington schools. Well beyond Lee's 150th birthday celebration had passed, Alexandria continued to embrace its renewed identity and Confederate connection. The modified hometown slogan not only appeared on letterhead, but also on official city reports, employee manuals, and publications, including a booklet published in 1960 to promote economic development opportunities. The publication, and you can see the cover here, was actually called City of Alexandria, Virginia, hometown of George Washington and Robert E. Lee, as if that was the most important thing to know about what Alexandria had accomplished and was offering in 1960. The revised slogan was soon reinforced with imagery on welcome signs posted at Alexandria's city limits. Lee's silhouette and Confederate flag appeared opposite George Washington's silhouette and the U.S. flag. The sign reads, "Historic Alexandria, Virginia greets you," and below the city seal, "Gateway to the South." The R. E. Lee Camp of Sons of Confederate Veterans continued to encourage a connection between the city and Lee, and the centennial of the Civil War offered a multitude of opportunities. On May 24, 1961, on the 100th anniversary that Alexandria troops mustered at Princeton, Washington, and then marched off to join Confederate forces, the Sons of Confederate Veterans rededicated the Confederate Memorial and presented it to the city. Among the speakers was Congressman William Jennings Bryant Dorn of South Carolina, a segregationist at the time whose local home was in Alexandria. Dorn used the opportunity to invoke the threat of communism and to condemn the Freedom Riders, who he said, quote, "invade the privacy of our time-honored sacred institutions and travel many miles to disobey local and state laws." Other participants included several City of Alexandria officials, including Councilman James Luckett, who belonged to the R. E. Lee camp. A high-ranking city employee, an assistant city manager in fact, named Eugene Barnwell, sang Lee's favorite hymn, and also led the audience in singing "Carry Me Back to Old Virginia." One local paper at the time reported that among the crowd of 300 were, quote, "a handful of impassive Negroes." But the article offered no other details about them or their impassivity. However, later that summer, local civil rights activists and some from out of town, organized by the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, planned protests in Alexandria. The local Alexandria Nonviolent Action Group threatened to hold something they called wade-ins at the city's white pools, and to also target downtown merchants for boycott during an annual sales promotion. In August, 10 activists were arrested in restaurant sit-ins organized by CORE. Meanwhile, the city continued to embrace Lee and even authorized funding so that the Sons of Confederate Veterans and the United Daughters of the Confederacy could present the city with a gift that would hang in the city council chambers for more than 50 years. In January 1963, on the anniversary of Lee's birth, the R. E. Lee Camp and the Mary Custis Lee 17th Virginia Regiment UDC chapter presented the city with a portrait of Lee in his Confederate uniform. The R.E. Lee camp had purchased the painting, valued at $6,000, but only after the city council granted them a loan of $4,000 to pay for the purchase. The lieutenant governor joined Mayor Frank Mann and other city leaders at the portrait's unveiling at a party in the dining room of the George Mason Hotel. During the celebration, Delegate Thompson, who was then serving as the first lieutenant commander for the R.E. Lee camp, Thompson introduced Lieutenant Governor Mills Godwin. According to the Alexandria Gazette, the celebration was no place for Yankees. Councilman James Luckett, who again was a member of the R.E. Lee camp, directed a salute to the Confederate flag, and Eugene Barnwell, who by then was the city's General Services Administrator. Barnwell sang at least 2 Confederate songs before leading the entire party in singing Dixie. That spring, the city did approve anti-discrimination legislation that would open city facilities to all and remove racial barriers in city hiring. But the city was still slow to hire blacks for positions of responsibility and those with public visibility. After Alexandria was named an All-American City by the National Municipal League in 1964, CORE organized more protests in Alexandria to draw attention to the unequal treatment and lack of opportunities blacks in Alexandria still experienced. The city had long displayed the Confederate flag for ceremonial occasions and even replaced worn-out ones with new ones in 1965. But by the late 1960s, African Americans and even some white Alexandrians spoke out against its use. In 1968, a group of students at T.C. Williams, the Interracial Human Relations Council, brought their concerns to City Council and presented a petition requesting that the flag not be flown because it was a symbol of slavery and offensive to a large segment of the city. Several whites spoke in support of the petition, with one pointing out that, quote, stars and bars to the Negro in our country was what the swastika was to Jews in Germany. And another stated that it was, quote, a symbol of one race over another and the banner of those who want to keep the Negro in his place. In response, Donald Baldwin, the former commander of the R.E. Lee camp, spoke out in support of the flag at the city council meeting. But he did so without mentioning his association with the Sons of Confederate Veterans. He pointed out that the city's stationery noted Alexandria was the hometown of Lee, and a portrait of Lee was on display in council chambers. And then Paul Porter, who was the head of the local Sons of Confederate Veterans, said, quote, Alexandria has long boasted that our city was the home of General Robert E. Lee. One cannot keep Lee and then throw away the Confederate flag. Of course, both he and Baldwin had failed to disclose that it was their chapter that had urged the city to adopt the, quote, hometown slogan in the first place. The city council did not make any changes to the flag flying practice. A year later, demonstrators trampled and destroyed a Confederate flag during an anti-police protest, and candidates for city council weighed in on if and when the city should display it at all. Then in 1970, after the election of Councilman Ira Robinson, who was the first black council member since Reconstruction, the city council voted to scale back the use of the Confederate flag. Robinson considered the flag to be, quote, symbol of slavery and oppression. Council directed that the flag would only be displayed on Veterans Day, Confederate Memorial Day, and Lee's birthday. Finally, in 2015, the city ended the practice completely. Other symbols of the city's association have recently changed also. The portrait of Lee remained in City Council chambers until 2017. It was then that it was moved to the Lyceum, which is now the city's History Museum. At the time, Mayor Allison Silverberg said the museum was, quote, a more appropriate place for the painting. Still, her official letterhead as mayor carried the longtime slogan with Lee's name. Her successor, Justin Wilson, did not continue that tradition when he took office in 2019. Although as a council member, he too had used it. As mayor, his letterhead carries no slogan at all, just the city seal and the All-America City logo. And as I close here, I just want to share another letterhead image, which is not of the Lee slogan or the Confederate flag, but it was one that Councilman Ira Robinson created for his message to constituents in 1971, with a clenched fist opposite the city seal. Thank you.